Okay, so in this demo, what I want to do is look at some of the new reach shaders that are available to us, and in particular I want to look at how we can create compliant models using the free Softimage Mod Tool, which is available through the Games Creator Clubs and other routes. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to have three parts of this. There's going to be a bit of code in Visual Studio using XNA4, there's going to be a bit of Softimage, and I'm going to use Paint.net to do some minor tweaks of the textures. And I'm going to get straight on because it's quite a lot to get through. Okay, so I'm going to go to Softimage, I'm going to set my user view and make that full screen here, and I'm going to start by just creating a level, a simple level, which is going to be the basis of the demo, and it's all going to be based on a simple grid for convenience. And the idea here is that the DualTextureEffect is the sort of thing that is the ideal effect to use where you're going to have a static lit model, and sort of game level is exactly that sort of thing. Okay, so I've highlighted using the I key all of the edges here, and I'm going to press Ctrl D and V. So Ctrl D duplicates those edges and V allows me to shift them up. Okay, I'm just creating a simple screen here on two sides of my mesh. Switch on shaded and also the headlight for the moment so that we can see what's going on. Okay, and this is going to be the basis of our level. With the U key, if I select the model again, and select U, I can pick these 9 panels here. So these polygons I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate again, and V to shift them up. And the center one will pick, duplicate that, and just pull that up in. So what I'm doing here is really just, I want to select a few shapes and stuff around the edge here to using exactly the same technique. And really it's when we come to look at the lighting effect, so that we've got something in our model which is going to cast some shadows and things. Okay, so that's the main modeling bit done. So I'm going to freeze the model at that point, and we're going to now go press Control and 7 to bring up our material manager. And we're going to create ourselves a new material. Now before we do that, we need to make sure that the textures that we're going to use in this material are present in our project. So I pause there and cut across to my Windows game. And what I'm going to do here is just use some pre-existing textures, which I'm going to drop into the content here. And if we have a look in there, I've got one which is concrete. So I've copied those into the project, and that's the texture I'm going to reference from within Softimage here, because it does create absolute paths to those, which is a little bit irritating. But there we go. So I've created a Fong shader, default Fong shader, which we can call concrete, just to keep things a little bit organized. And I'm going to select here an image rather than a color using a little plug icon, and that new from file, and we will just locate the one that I just added here. So textures, concrete, and here's the image, and it's fairly low res, 256 by 256, not a great deal to it. I'm going to drop it onto the model here, and initially we won't see anything even if we turn on the textured setting here, because we need to create a texture projection for this model, which is a property for it. So with it selected, I go to property, texture projection, and we'll select unique UVs, and that means a UV per polygon. And let's just have a look at that. So that's created the mapping over the surface, but it's really blurred, and that's because we've got the texture being mapped over the whole model. Now what I want to do is repeat the texture over the model, because it's so that when you're close to, you see it fairly fine-grained. So I select the model, press Alt and 7, and that opens up the texture editor. Here I can select all of my vertices, and using the X button I can scale the whole lot way outside of the viewable texture in the editor, but that actually tiles the texture over the surface, and now when we zoom in, you get that nice fine detail close up. So that's really the main model. I'm going to freeze it now, and we're going to export that just to check it out in our project. So I'm going to go to Crosswalk, export FBX file from the Crosswalk. Make sure you've updated Crosswalk. If you haven't, have a look at my blog, and there's some details on how to go about updating Crosswalk, but you need really the later version than the one it's installed. The one that comes installed by default has got quite a few updates to it now. In my options here, I don't want to do cameras, I don't want to do lights, but I'll export everything else. I always get this error. If anyone knows how to resolve that and what to do about it, I'd love to hear from you, but it doesn't seem to affect my results. So that's exported it. Let's cut to the project now. In the content, I'm going to add the existing item, which is that model we just created, the map.fbx file. There it is. And now I'm going to do a little bit of coding, and I'm going to use stuff from my library here, which I've just included at the top. The rest of this project is completely untouched from the basic one that you get when you use the app wizard at the start. But I'm going to use some components that are in my library, and I'm going to start with a camera component, which is a basic 3D camera, which we'll call camera. And a new one of those. And we want a controller, which is going to be a simple one-player controller, which we'll call control. And that's just reference. So if you've not used components before, take a look at my blog again, and I've detailed about the idea of components and surfaces. I think it's a brilliant model, and it works really well, especially for these short little projects. So I'm linking the control to the camera there, and then finally, of course, we need our mesh, which is a drawable 3D effect mesh to start with, which we'll call map. We want a new one of those, and in this case, we just need to pass it the asset name, which is map, which comes off the importer through the map FBX there. Okay, so that's my 3 objects, and then the way that I add those is to do components dot add, and then just add them in one at a time. So we want the camera. Let's just go pink, pink. So we want the camera, we want the controller, and we want the map. Okay, and that really should be all we need to make this model render as a basic effect mesh, and that's really the essential route through XSI to get a basic model out. But as you can see, it's pretty horrible rendering. So what we're going to do now is overlay a second texture with some of those extra bits of information on. So I'm going to cut back to Softimage now. And what we want to do in this case is create an overlay texture map. So I'm going to create 2 of those. One of them is called an ambient occlusion map, which I'm going to go to create as a property render map of the model. And we're going to sample the whole surface, but we're going to need some new UVs because we want these ones to be not repeating like the other ones. So our model now has 2 texture projections. Notice this is texture projection 1 in addition to the other texture projection. I'm going to choose a PNG just for convenience here, and we're going to save that out to our projects location again, textures, and we're going to call it amb oc for ambient occlusion map. Now the ambient occlusion map is essentially so I'm just selecting these and do regenerate maps. This is just going to find all of the recesses and creases in the model, if you like, where light would just the ambient light would get less, would be able to get to less, and so it makes little sharp shading around all those edges, and it really brings out the detail of the model. Okay, so we don't need to do any more in Softimage. We've just created the image. Let's take a look at that. If we have a look in our model folder here, which is Windows Game 1. Okay, so this is the ambient occlusion map, and you can see it's added shading and stuff across the whole surface. The map itself is only one other 256 pixel map, even though it's now over the entire model. And so we need to blend the 2 together. And the way we do that is to use a 3D, in my case, dual texture mesh, which I've created in the library. But we'll create one of those, and then I'll look at the code. Okay. And as well as the model now, and remember the model already has the concrete texture embedded in it, so I only need to pass in the other texture, which in this case will be called amb oc. Okay, and I need to add that one in, so add the existing item we just created, ambient occlusion PNG. Okay, now the other thing I need to do is let's take a look at the code from my library, and in particular the draw method. So essentially what it's going to do here is it's going to look for a dual texture effect embedded in my model mesh, and when it finds one it's going to cast the effect to it, and then it's going to set the overlay texture to be the texture 2 property of the dual texture effect. Question is, how does it get the dual texture effect into the model in the first place? Well, we just use the default FBX pipeline properties here. So the FBX file properties brings up the details of the content processor we're going to use, which is the XNA framework one, and in there is the opportunity to set the default effect to be a dual texture effect in this case. Okay, so now what's going to happen is, as long as the model is compliant, it will work. Now initially it wouldn't have worked because we needed 2 lots of texture projections. Okay, so now we've created 2 lots of texture projections on our model, and just to verify that, if I go F8 here, just so you know where this is, under the polygon mesh clusters texture coordinates, you can see we've got 2 texture projections that are independent of one another. So I'm just going to save this model out again over the top of the old one. So this is the model with 2 texture coordinates, but all the other settings are the same, and that should be it. And now let's fire that up. Okay, and this time round we should see, he said confidently, what have I got wrong there? Okay, that'll be me not putting textures instead of texture in the... Let's try that again. Okay, so you can see, I hope already, that this is a much more interesting map. So it's added that shading throughout the map to really highlight the details of it. Okay, way better. But we can do even more than that. If I cut back to Softimage now, let's add some lights in. So I'm going to add in primitives, lights, and we can add in some point lights here. Okay, and I can take the point light and we can just move it around. Okay, and if we want to see what's going on here, we can switch off my headlight so we can see some indication. It's only a very rough indication of what's going on with the point lights. So I'll have one up there, and we'll perhaps make this one a sort of warmy colour, like an orange or something. Like that. And we'll have another one of those, I think, over in the other corner. So a new light, spotlight this time for variety's sake. So in this case what we want to do is just take the point of interest, if we can grab it, and the light will follow that point of interest. So let's have the point of interest right over here. And let's drop the light as well down nice and low to make for more interesting lighting as well. Okay, so something like that. Obviously you're going to spend a lot more time playing with your lights than me. Crucially though, once the lights are set up, you must remember this, okay? You must set the properties of the lights. So I'm going to do that with Alt-Enter with the light selected. We must do that the shadows are enabled, and that the shadow map in this case is also switched on for this light, because we're going to use that to create our render map. So the same for this other point light here. So I just select the point light, Alt-Enter brings up its properties. So generally shadows enabled, shadow map enabled. Okay, that should be all we need to do. Take the model and we're going to create a new render map. Broadly the same, certainly the same image format settings and similar location, but this time we're going to call it illumination. Okay, that. And we can use the existing secondary protection so that it overlays with the ambient occlusion, and down here we just select illumination only. Don't need to worry about bump maps, don't have any, and Reach doesn't support them. And we generate that map, and let's take a look at that. So now we have an illumination map as well here, which includes our shadows and what have you over the surface. So that's pretty good. But what we'd like to do is just join the two together. So in paint.net now, I'm going to take my illumination map and my ambient occlusion map and open that as a layer over the top. And in layers, I'll set the layer property to be multiply to combine the two together, and we'll save that off as a new map now called Combi. Combi with a C at the beginning. Save that off. OK, and flatten the image to do so. Back to my game. Add my new Combi map in. There it is, looks good. And use that instead of my ambient occlusion map. And let's take a look at that now. So hopefully you can see that is a much better map now. Really far more interesting than the previous one. Crucially though, from a calculations point of view, because all of the lighting effects in this map have been done offline, that's actually really trivial, that model to render, and there is in fact no dynamic lighting being rendered on it at all.